everyone for joining us today for our second lecture of the semester. My name is Caitlin Sager. I am a program coordinator with the Mansfield Center. We are really excited to be able to welcome Danielle from the Women's Foundation of Montana today. She just returned from a trip to Southeast Asia as part of our Professional Fellows Exchange Program. The Professional Fellows Program is a program funded by the U.S. Department of State designed to promote better relations between the U.S. and Southeast Asia and help with civil society development in Southeast Asia. Today's program is also being recorded through a grant from Missoula Community Television. We are so excited to have them here and to have our lectures available online for streaming for all lectures throughout the semester. We do have upcoming lectures, including some great talks on the situation in the Korean Peninsula, U.S. relations with Japan, and many more, so please consider taking a flyer. We also have a great program that is designed to encourage women's leadership that has applications open right now, the Montana New Leadership Program. That's open to women undergraduates who are from Montana or enrolled in a Montana university. It's a great 5-day residential program with a lot of hands-on training and workshops and a chance to meet many amazing leaders here in Montana. We have information on that as well. Please take a flyer. We also have more information on the Women's Foundation, and so after the program, please do take whatever you'd like. I will now turn it over to Jen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. So in preparing this little talk, I couldn't decide whether to talk more about women's leadership or more about my lived experience on this trip. So you are going to get a combination of those things. And I would love it if you would also, it's not working. No, it was working. Feel free to ask questions. And I would love for it to be more of a conversation too. So, no, it was just working. You get to do it. Okay, thank you. As I was introduced, my name is Jen Ewell. I'm the director of the Women's Foundation of Montana. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that with you too to give you some context. Go ahead. Yay! This is a part of the Mansfield Center's wonderful YSEALI exchange program. And if you don't know about that, then I encourage you to learn more because it's an amazing program. It's an amazing opportunity for Montanans to get international experience while really helping and mentoring young people from Southeast Asia. So. Certainly you should learn more. So here are my global partners. So this is Vaughn and Saya, and they came to Montana in May and spent a month with me. They're pictured here with Pam Cody, who is the head of our Department of Commerce. So our partnership was really about a shared interest and work in women's leadership in our different countries. And Saya, let's see if I can get this thing to work. Saya Point is from Myanmar, and she works with the Mon Women's Organization. And Vaughn Manichon is from Laos, and her work is with CARE International on women's leadership as well in rural areas. So when they were here with me, they shadowed me as I traveled the state. They visited some of our grantees. They also went to Helena and learned a little bit about our government and our partnerships with the state on women's leadership as well. And they shadowed and observed our grant-making process with the Women's Foundation too. So we talked a lot about fundraising too. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Women's Foundation of Montana, the thing that we're most known for, of course, is our grant making. So we do small grants of about $5,000 to $10,000 a piece to organizations across the state of Montana. In addition to women's leadership, really our focus is on economic outcomes for Montana women and girls. So that's the kind of thing we're investing in. We're investing in STEAM programs for girls and in programs that teach young women how to negotiate for better pay, and we're investing in programs like the New Leadership Program that the Mansfield Center puts on. And we also put out research on women and economics and host our own women's leadership initiatives, which I'll talk more about. Uh-oh. This That's weird. Okay. The main tools that are sort of our theory of change is that we're interested in supporting women's learning. So we're interested in them having the tools they need to be successful through education. We're also interested in women's leadership and power, and we're interested in using those to create systemic change. So because our partnership was around leadership, I wanted to share a little bit about our particular work in leadership. Powerhouse Montana is an online initiative that we created to sort of connect women across the state of Montana. And the idea is that it helps them to find mentors and opportunities and resources. So it was in response to research we did in which Montana women told us they really needed to be able to connect to other women who had lived similar experiences and that would help them in their efforts. And out of Powerhouse grew Mentor Monday, which is a gathering that happens once a month in communities across the state where women get to know each other and mentor each other. And we also put on a women's leadership conference now on an annual basis as well. So in thinking about this partnership and our work, as well as my partner's work, I wanted to just think with you a little bit about why women's leadership even matters. And it's so interesting because depending upon your cultural perspective, that could be a lot of different things. So one of the things that I have found that is true regardless of whether you're talking about women leaders in the US or women leaders in some of the other countries that I've studied and visited now, what we can find is that women invest in family and community. So when we look at women's funders on an international basis, one of the things that they're most interested in is the fact that investing in women is a great economic development strategy. Because when you invest in women, they spend that money on their kids, they spend that money on education and health outcomes for their families and communities. The other thing about women leaders on an international basis is that they're more likely to think big picture, to think more holistically in their decision making and their problem solving. And they're also more likely to be collaborative and to be interested in coming to shared agreements, regardless of party lines and other differences. What was interesting in my work with my partners was that this idea of women's involvement in decision making coming to more sustainable outcomes wasn't one that I had really thought about much before. But the way that Saya and Vaughn think about their work is that they believe, and I believe it's true after studying them and their work, that when women are involved, the decisions that they come to and the actions that are taken are often ones that are more sustainable, in that they're ones that are less likely perhaps to be questioned. So that was interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before, but from their perspective, having women at the table meant that especially other women were more likely to accept the outcomes. So that was one way of thinking about women's leadership that was new to me. And of course, in the US, we often do research to figure out the bottom line. So when women are involved in business decisions, we know that that also leads to more profits. So that's one of the things that we study more in the US, but we know is true as well. So if you look at women's leadership in the different countries, what you'll find is that surprisingly, the US doesn't do that great. So this is one of the things that women from other countries often want to talk to me about, because in addition to being a part of this program, I often am invited to speak to different groups that visit in Helena and that kind of thing. So I get to talk to lots of women from other countries. And I think oftentimes they come to the US thinking, oh my gosh, this is like the promised land and women are doing so well. And what they find is that women aren't doing as well as they thought in a lot of ways, and it's really hard for all of us to wrap our brains around how that works and what that looks like. If you look at political leadership, I just took a few really basic indicators for us to look at here, but if you look at political leadership in Congress, in the US about 19% are women. In Myanmar, it's about 10%. In Laos, it's 28%. You may or may not know, Laos is a communist country, and so a lot of their outcomes are more prescribed. It's not as if these women were elected, so there's that difference. And Myanmar is really in its formative stages. It's a democracy, but it hasn't been for very long, and it still has a long way to go as far as women's leadership goes. So you can have that as a little bit of perspective here. As far as community leaders go, what I was looking at here was women who were either mayors in the US or in the other countries, village leaders. And so you can see that in community context, the US does far better. Women have been serving in leadership positions in the US for a lot longer historically than in Myanmar and Laos. And then in business, you know, we're kind of close to the same if you just look at business owners. If you were going to look at CEOs, I suspect it would be different, but it's really hard to find any data on that for Myanmar and Laos. And so it's interesting that women participate in these different countries in business, sort of in the economic sphere, in similar ways. So there are a lot of women who own their own businesses in these countries, which is interesting. And I thought it was really interesting that in Myanmar, the community leadership was so low. It was like almost non-existent. There's been a little bit of research with women who are village leaders, which is really intriguing. But it's going to take a long time, I think, in Myanmar for women's leadership to be accepted within communities. So that's just kind of a little big picture information for you. All right, so on my trip, I went in January. I went to Myanmar first, and my partner, Saya, works for the Mon Women's Organization, and so I spent most of my time in Myanmar and Mon State. And their work is really intriguing. So they're an amazing organization. They're internationally recognized for their work, even like with the UN and other international groups. And I felt really lucky, I guess, is what I would say about this, to be a part of it. For those of you who may not know much about Myanmar, it's very Buddhist. There are temples everywhere. The hills, I felt like the hills were bedazzled. It was like bling, like golden spires sticking out of the mountains everywhere. And so there's one of the Buddhas. They're all pretty shiny and beautiful and gold. It's quite a big country for Asia, 53 million people. Of course, quite low income. But you know, this $1,275 to us sounds like nothing, but actually there it goes quite a ways. It's amazing. There are a lot of people in poverty, but there are a lot of people who are able to have a pretty decent standard of life even at that income. Life expectancy is 66. And literacy, according to the government, is 90%. And this was true both in Myanmar and Laos, that my partners that I was working with felt like this was probably not very accurate. They didn't believe that it was this high, but this is the government stat. So these are the women of the Mon Women's Organization. In Myanmar, we spend a lot of time eating. And so this is how they welcomed me. We had a wonderful meal together. All of these women live together in the same home, in the office. They all live in the office space. Even the executive director, Mikun, who is an amazing, powerful woman, even internationally, and she lives in this tiny little room in their office. And they don't get paid very much, and they work really, really hard. And they're amazingly generous people. And these are a few of the women who do their programming in the villages. So most of the work that they do is to go out into the surrounding villages and help support women's leadership groups. So they start and help support small women's leadership self-empowerment groups. They also do a lot of education. So one of the things that happens in Myanmar is a lot of women will go to Thailand to work because they can make a lot more money in Thailand. But if they go, many times they experience really negative outcomes. So either they experience, sexual assault, or come back with sexually transmitted diseases is often a really common outcome. And so they're able to make a lot more income for their families, which is wonderful, but a lot of times the outcome for them is not great socially and physically. And so the Mon Women's Organization works to educate them before they go, with the hope that hopefully they can prevent some of the negative social outcomes and also help them figure out how to manage their money, because they have a little bit more money. So there's a financial education component to it as well. So in addition to that work, the Mon Women's Organization works to increase the number of women in leadership. So they educate women about the political system, and they're interested in seeing more women in leadership in Mon State. So far, they haven't had a lot of success, and Mikun is really the only one that has had some success, but almost all of the political leadership, at least on the state level in Myanmar, is still male at this point. And we talked a lot about their experience, and I'll probably share more about that later. But yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic in which the culture is incredibly welcoming and generous and respectful in many ways. But women do not find that they have the ability to make progress and gain the respect they need and the income they need to be successful. My main contribution, I felt like, to Saya and her work was that she asked me to do a day-long workshop while I was there, which was really interesting because I don't speak Burmese. So it had to be entirely translated, which meant that it took a really long time. But Saya was my translator, and so I felt like the ideas were being translated well because she had such a great understanding of our shared work. So the primary focus of the workshop was first to talk about women from both of our cultures and their individual change process. So I shared with them some different models that we use in individual change for women that I felt like, and I think they agreed, could be translated internationally. And then we talked about community and nationwide social change and different models that could be applied there. And each of the participants sat down in groups and talked about how they felt like they could use the models within their own work, and then presented it back to the rest of the group. And then in the afternoon, we talked a little bit about collaborative impact and the idea of how different organizations can work together on the same shared goals and make larger impact. So those were some of the things that I was able to share with them while I was there. In addition, I spent a lot of time in the villages. So because a lot of the Mon State women's work is in the rural villages, I went and met some of the different women's groups that they were supporting. I met and talked with a lot of the women entrepreneurs that they were helping to launch their businesses in some of the rural villages. So these women have a business in which they make cookies. So they have a traditional Mon cookie that everyone loves, and it's really delicious. And they make it by frying a really thin, kind of a crepe-like pancake, and then rolling that into a little roll, and then baking it like that so it's like thin and crispy. And so they make those every day and take them to a city nearby and sell them. And they've actually done really well. Which is great because so many of the rural community, the women who are starting businesses in the rural communities, struggle with the transportation and the market and a lot of different factors. But they've really got it figured out. So that was fun to see their work and how they were making it happen. This picture down here is one of the community groups that I went to visit. So in their work, they try and just work with women and increase their confidence and leadership skills, and then let them decide what their group's going to work on in their community. This particular group is working on domestic violence as an issue, as well as drug use in their youth. So those are a couple of the big challenges that they're facing. Most of the women in this community work in the rubber plantations, so they work really hard for not very much money. But what they do have is a great sense of shared community and a lot of really strong relationships. And one of the things that was great about this conversation was this gentleman on the end, who's one of their tribal leaders, who was very invested in the success of the women's group and the work that they were doing on domestic violence, as well as drug use in their communities. And what I found in my work is that having male support was really, really important to the outcomes of these groups, because women don't have the status yet. But if there's a tribal leader who's supporting their work, then suddenly their input and their work becomes much more important. So that was my time in Laos. I spent about a week in each country. That was my time in Myanmar. Then I went to Laos. Vaughn, who is right here, was my partner in Laos. She likes to take selfies. I have lots of pictures. And she's an amazing young woman. So Vaughn works for CARE International, and she works on their Women's Leadership Initiative. Most of the work that CARE International does is actually on supporting people in creating better infrastructure around water and food production. But they do have a women's leadership component, partially because they agree with some of the things we were talking about earlier, that investing in women is really one of the keys to economic success for communities. So Vaughn's work is primarily going to the very rural villages. So one of the things about Laos is that the road system is horrendous. So you have to hire somebody with a nice big truck to get anywhere, is what I found, because the roads are so bad. Because it's really mountainous and they have huge floods. And so even if they create a great road, then the rainy season comes and washes it out. And then you have to drive over a big mudslide to get anywhere. So that's what we were doing. And a lot of these villages in Laos still have very limited access even to the internet. What I found in both Myanmar and Laos is that they did have schools. The children do not always go because they have to work in the fields. But they do, even in rural villages, mostly have some kind of educational system in place. And part of the educational system is really linked to the temples as well. So the monks are one of the greatest places you can get your education from. So many of the children will actually end up being monks for a while, so that they can, I'm sure because they believe in it, but also so they can have access to a better education. So some of the young people who work with Vaughn in her workplace, for instance, were educated by monks. That's really common. So everywhere has small schools, and everywhere has Buddhist temples, and a lot of very small homes with not very much access to the internet or cell phones or any of our sort of modern communication devices. So it's really interesting. I mean, it's quite, I would imagine, similar to what it has been for a really long time. A lot of people work in the rice fields, and that's what they do. They don't sell a lot of their products. They exist mostly, by what they grow. And what's wonderful about Laos, from my perspective, coming from the U.S., is that all of the food is incredibly fresh because there's no stores, so you're just buying it from, the local people, and that's what you're eating all the time. So I laughed because this is a picture of us eating fish soup. And you just get the fish and put it in there with the head and the tail and everything. Just eat it. What I found was that every night, Vaughn would say to me, "Would you like to eat fish soup?" And I would say, "Sure, didn't we have fish soup last night?" And she would say, "Yeah, but this is a different fish soup." So I had a different fish soup practically every night I was there. They have lots of fish. And this village up here is one that was very far from any other city. I don't know, you probably can't, I think there's a bigger picture later where you can see a lot of the people still wear their traditional native dress. These are just a few pictures of, these are the monks, even in my small town where I was staying, Kua, which is near the border to Vietnam, kind of up north in Laos. There was a nice temple with a whole bunch of monks. And then these other pictures were, as I was leaving, I went to Luang Prabang, which is a bigger city that has really beautiful temples and buildings, and it has been recognized as a sort of a historic city nationally, internationally. I just couldn't resist showing you my pretty pictures too. So this is the night market, and that's one of their temples. It was gorgeous. Here is some of Vaughn's work. So Vaughn's work is really, again, about supporting women in leadership. These women all came to one central location from surrounding villages. They had to travel for a couple days, some of them, to get there. And her work with them is primarily just on building their self-confidence. That's pretty much what she does. So what was interesting about her work is a lot of the techniques that she uses would be the same ones that I would use here in the US. So we worked with these women. They had to introduce themselves, and they spent about 2 hours deciding like what they were going to say and how they were going to do it. And then they got up and introduced themselves. And then we spent a couple hours on sort of confidence building games, kind of like what we would think of as like icebreakers and team building kind of activities. And they did, on the second day, get to think some about what are some of the challenges in their villages and talk with each other about what they would like to do about those things as well. And what I learned from Vaughn is that the reason she's able to do this work with these women, it took her several years to be able to build the program up to the point where village leaders would actually send women to the trainings. And the reason she's able to do it is because the women, after they come through her trainings, are more able to sell their goods and go to the cities and actually bring home income for their families and communities. And so that's really, it's all dependent upon that outcome. Basically, the economic outcome is what the women's leadership work that she does has to be all about. This up here is the office in Kua. I got to work with Vaughn a little bit there as well. And this is a picture of one of the rural villages. Most people do live in small huts that are made out of bamboo still and leaves, and it's quite traditional. And they're amazingly kind and fun people. So in addition to the work she does with the women's leadership presentations and trainings, she also works on financial education. And I don't have a photo of this because it was so dark in the home that we were in that night. But I was able to participate in one of her financial groups that she hosts with women. And so the way it works is that every woman who wants to participate agrees to put a certain amount of money into a shared treasure box each month, and they have one person who's in charge of the accounting and one person who's in charge of recruitment, and it's all very organized. And so they all put their money in each month, and they keep records of how much everyone has put in. And once they've been doing it for 12 months, then they start providing loans. So women in the community who need money, for instance, to buy school clothes for their kids are able to take out a loan with the agreement that they have to pay it back within 3 months. And so it's very, very small micro enterprise kind of funding, but they're able to fund each other to kind of follow their dreams a little bit. And sometimes they're able to start businesses that way. And it also is really just about helping them to think about what it means to have some money, you know, what it means to save some money and then be able to invest it, and what a difference that can make for your family and your community. So that's another big part of their work. So these are a couple of my takeaways, and I would love to have conversations about all of these things with all of you. I felt like it was such an amazing experience for me personally, but I wasn't sure how to summarize it to tell all of you what that means. So one of the things that I found is one that I think we all know, but women, wherever you are stronger and braver than they know. So one of the amazing experiences I had, for instance, in Laos was that in the home where we had our little women's financial club meeting, they allowed me to stay in their home, and it was quite humble, and they gave up, you know, their bed for me. And after, they have to have their meetings late at night because they have to wait until after everybody gets back from the rice fields and after everybody's been fed. And so their meetings are like between 8 and 10 at night. So when the meeting wrapped up, and I was, you know, in someone else's bed, I could hear the woman whose house I was staying in out in their outdoor kitchen pounding the rice and getting it ready for in the morning. And so I know that she wasn't done until, you know, midnight. And then she got up again at 5 in the morning and made breakfast for her family and went and worked in rice field. And meanwhile, you know, I slept in her bed and then went in a big fancy truck on to the next village. So it was a very humbling experience, I would say. The other thing that I know both from, so you should know that I have a bunch of degrees from the University of Montana. And one of them was a master's in environmental study, and one was a master's in social work. And so in pursuit of that degree, I did a bunch of research on international women's leadership, and especially what politicizes women internationally was my area of focus. So at what point will women break out of their traditional role and choose to step forward into a position of leadership, even though it's scary and they probably are going to encounter negative feedback. And so what I found in that research was that internationally, the point at which that happens for most women is the point at which they feel like their family and their community is at risk. So then it becomes worth it to them to step into that role, even though they don't want to, and it's going to be really horrible, probably. They'll do it anyway. And so that was interesting for me to kind of see that in person and how it works out in small communities in Southeast Asia. And so that was one of the things that I really felt came home for me too, was women's common dedication to the health and well-being of their families, and just the lengths that they'll go to secure that. I thought one of the other things that was really impressed upon me was that women's leadership really had to be based in positive economic outcomes for it to be supported. So here in the US, I think we have a lot more freedom to think about, you know, oh, this leader is going to succeed, and it's vital that they be put into this place because they're smart and because they have this education and because, you know, all of these different things. But in Laos and Myanmar, in order for a woman to be in leadership, it had to be because they felt like she was really going to make sure that there were going to be better economic outcomes for that community, which was really interesting. It's just an entirely different way of thinking about the world and people and their value. And part of it too, which I didn't realize until I got there, is that in Asia, it's not, at least in these countries, it isn't about the individual person, you know, it's about the group and the community. So here's an illustration of that. When I got to Myanmar, I asked Saya why I couldn't tip people, because it's so strange, you know, you're not allowed to tip anyone. It's not accepted. And she said it's because in their opinion, they didn't do anything to deserve that, and that really it was like a group effort and a community effort. If I had a great experience at a restaurant, you know, the waitress doesn't feel like it was because of her. She feels like it was because of the whole kitchen and the person who owns the restaurant and their community and the people who grew the food. And so it's just such a different way of thinking. And so this conversation of women's leadership has to be seated within that way of thinking, if that makes sense. So, what happened? I don't know what happened. Sorry, guys. Anyway, we'll just go back to here. Wait. Oh yeah, here we go. This is what I was starting to get to. So, women's roles are still very limited in Myanmar in particular, but also still in Laos. Women wear skirts. Women don't really go out at night, especially not by themselves. They do not drink alcohol very much. So there's a lot of rules around what is acceptable and what is not. I got to do a few of those things in the company of other people, but especially a woman alone would not be doing those things. So there's lots of different ways in which women can't participate fully in lots of different experiences, if that makes sense. Men's advocacy is vital. I talked about that a little bit. I met some of the men who are great advocates for women. They're amazing. And they really do have the same vision, I think, that we have, that women's equal participation, you know, is so important to outcomes for their children and their future and their country. But there aren't very many of them, unfortunately, at this point. So I think that is definitely one of the goals of all of the programs that I work with, is to engage men and to increase their level of advocacy and support for women's leadership. One of the things that was really brought home to me over and over again is the fact that there aren't many policy options. So if you are working on change, it really has to be with individuals, it has to be in community, it has to be in that really lived experience. In Laos, with the communist government, they have no access to any sort of political leverage. In Myanmar, they have some, but it's quite limited still. Myanmar has a government that's still trying to figure out how to kind of run itself. They have a whole bunch of different ethnic groups, and they're all trying to figure out how to get along, how to keep the peace, as you know, I'm sure is made apparent by the situation with the Rohingya, and then also then how to create shared systems of governance and justice and all kinds of things. And so they don't have policy options really at this point. So the work that you're doing to support and increase women's leadership has to be in the grassroots and on a real sort of micro scale, and then building up from there. So international involvement is vital, primarily resources. So all these programs are supported primarily by grants from other international funding sources. So that's how this work gets done, and it wouldn't get done otherwise. Strong women role models, I think, are probably one of the most powerful strategies. So because, for instance, Vaughn grew up in a rural village in Laos. Her father died. Actually, both of my partners' fathers died when they were young, which is really interesting. But Vaughn's father died when she was young, and because there was no boy in the family, they destroyed her home, the other villagers. So then she and her mother were homeless. They moved to another village and lived with her mom's brother. But in that home, because they were kind of hangers-on, she had to work really hard, and so she worked in the fields a lot, and she never went to school until she was 14. And she asked every year if she could go to school, and she couldn't go to school because she had to work. And finally, when she was 14, she was allowed to go to school, but she had to take her siblings with her. So she sat her little brother and sister next to her at school, and she started at 14 with kindergarten, and worked her way through multiple grades every year until she caught up. And she still, I think, didn't graduate until she was in her 20s, but she did, and then she went on to college. And she's such an amazing woman, especially when you see her, in the context of where she was from and the outcomes that many of her peers have, which is, primarily they are moms and they work and support their families and their mothers. So, having a young woman like Vaughn, who has chosen this entirely different path, and then having her come back to the villages where she's from and others that she knows and is of the same ethnic background as is so important to young women and their idea of who it is that they might become. I think that is one of the most powerful strategies that we can possibly invest in, is supporting those young women who have the desire and the interest in going on and being educated and traveling and then coming back and sharing that experience with their peers. So another thing that I really had to come to accept is that change is very slow. And I know that's true from American history, but it's even far more true in Southeast Asia. And so these women are going to work their whole lives on this. And then the next generation will work their whole lives on this. And so much of the outcome of their work is dependent on, different powers that are beyond their control. So that is the thing, that you come to in the end, is that you have to come to accept that this is a way of life, that you're going to invest your life, they're going to invest their lives, and all of us together are just going to keep working at it. And there is not going to be, a big win anytime soon. So that's what I had to come to accept in thinking about women's leadership in the context of these cultures. So I think that hopefully some of the things that I talked about, that we all talked about while I was in Laos and Myanmar, were helpful. I think they were. One of the great things I got to do was edit Saya's paper. So she has to write in English for all of these different applications that she does, and it's really hard. So I got to help her some with her English, which I think is good. She actually went to Australia the week after I left and presented at an international conference, which is awesome. I think that some of the connections, hopefully, that I was able to make for them. So one of the things that I tried to do was to connect them with potential funding sources and other organizations doing similar work. The Women's Foundation of Montana is part of the Women's Funding Network, which is an international body of women's funds that fund all over the world. So I was able to connect them with some of those funds. So I'm hopeful that there will be positive outcomes from those relationships. I think that for some people, some of their partners, the fact that I came was really cool. So I think that it helped increase their leverage amongst their different community and statewide partners. So I'm hopeful that that was a way in which our partnership will be helpful to them. And one of the things that it was fun for me to think about coming back, well, two things really. So I would love to try and figure out if there are ways for me and other women in the US to connect a lot of the women who have really small enterprises in these countries to a larger marketplace in which they could sell their goods for a lot more money, because they do not get very much, and they spend, it's amazing, the crafts and the things that they're creating are beautiful and take days to create, and they only get paid a few dollars for them from the tourists and other folks in their own countries. But if we could create an online marketplace, so anyway, I'm just thinking about that. I think that would be a really fun outcome that hopefully I can help create for them. And I think just personally for me, I came back with a sense that I am so lucky, and that although we may feel like our political system is a mess, and we may feel like change is so hard, when you put it in a global perspective, my job is a lot easier than it was when I left. So that was one of the outcomes for me personally. And when we think about women's leadership and this work, one of the things, of course, that I am always thinking about is this girl. This is my daughter, Amelia, and she's 9. And I think that this trip really helped me see. I think that not only is this work vital here, but everywhere, for all of our daughters, all over the world. And that Amelia's future is so incredibly bright. So this is why I do that work, and this is, I think, also why so many of the women who I met are doing this work as well. So it's a nice feeling of sort of global sisterhood. We're in this together. And that's me. And I'd love to have a conversation if you all had questions. Yes?
Jen, thanks for your presentation.
You are welcome.
I have a really curious question.
Yes?
So when I moved to Montana, I became really exposed to the myth that because of our agrarian roots, men and women had this egalitarianism because they all were working the land and ranching animals together. Right. And I would perceive that this culture that you went to visit is similar in that way. They're all working hard.
They are.
And I'm really curious if you had any perception around the roots of some of those cultural limitations on women as far as not going out at night or not drinking or only being worthy of being invested in if there was a return on investment. Did you get any sense of what the cultural roots of those cultural limitations were?
Yeah.
Was it a faith-based thing? Was it something else?
That's a good question. I would have said probably first, I do think there's a faith element to a lot of the modesty and limitations, but I do not know enough about it to be able to say for sure exactly how that works. And I also found that Buddhism was slightly different, I think, in Laos and Myanmar, and I don't really understand exactly how that works or what the differences are, but I do think it's a little different. And it's funny that you talk about sort of Montana and our farming roots, and I've heard that before too. You may have heard Diane Sands present on that, but I do think it's true that there, as well as here, there is a sense of equality in all of us contributing to the shared work and the shared prosperity. But I think there's just so many other elements that come into play outside of that, including both, like the religion is certainly part of it. I just think culturally, it's so, like modesty is so important, and I think that so much of, from what I could see, and again, this is like my American perspective, so much of the value of the women in the culture was because of what they contributed domestically, so in the home and with the kids, and it's so vital, and so much of their value was around that. Cooking was incredibly huge, and men don't cook much at all from what I could see. Men do sometimes care for the children a little bit while their wives are cooking and cleaning, but women pretty much do the cooking and cleaning. So I think that it's just, there's just a lot, it's still more strictly held, a lot of those what we would consider to be gendered roles. And they don't have, if you think about why ours are not so gendered anymore, a lot of it are things that they don't have yet. So not very many women leave the villages to go on to higher education. There aren't a lot of jobs available outside the home or outside the agricultural sphere. So I think a lot of it is tied to that. And I think, as women sort of go out into the workplace more, and there's more roles for women, that might change. But I don't know exactly. Sorry. It is really hard to figure out different cultures, especially if you don't speak the language. I was constantly asking my partners to try and explain different dynamics that were happening, and they both speak English really well, but still it's really hard. And even between my two partners, so they got to know each other quite well when they were here, it was sometimes hard for them to explain to each other some of the different cultural differences and why that worked. They found that they didn't even have words in each other's languages for some of the things, and we certainly don't in English. So that makes it really hard to get concepts when there isn't even really a word in your language for what it is they're talking about. sorry. I wish I could tell you more. It would take me a lot more time there and a lot more research to figure out a lot of that really sort of subtle social stuff. Yeah.
I have a question about like educating young women about leadership opportunities as they age. And you were saying how it's so important to have men as the advocates to support that. So I was wondering if there's parallel education going on for young boys at the same time as young women.
That is a good question. Not that I know of. I didn't hear or see anything like that. I do think, though, that because some of the women are more involved in these leadership groups and in different efforts now, they're educating their sons. I met some of the sons of the women who I was getting to know, and I think that their experience will be quite different than young men has been in the past. So that was kind of interesting. There was one boy who sat and observed one of our conversations, and he was super shy and he kept hiding behind everyone, but he would like peek his head out and listen, and his mom was teasing him and saying how he comes and listens to all of her meetings that she has. So one of the other things I found, which is interesting, that reminds me, is that a lot of the women who are sort of starting these leadership groups are like the health provider for their community. They have gone on to some kind of nursing school or something, and then they come back. And so they've become kind of like, the healer and the educator and have some social power. And so then they start these groups and invite other women to come and learn and think about what they want to do to change social outcomes. Yeah. So, yeah.
We have homestayed many of the Wycelies.
Nice.
And
Thank you.
You're welcome. I do think that this program here gives encouragement and empowerment to so many of these guests
Yeah,
who come
absolutely.
here. And I also find we do mostly young men, but we have had women as well. But we meet the group pretty much. And I do think the men that we have, if they do have families at home, are very much involved in the wife and her role too.
Yeah.
And I think that comes from experience. These people we have are very well educated, and they've worked very hard for that, very hard. But it's amazing how bright they are and what they can take back.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the fellows that come with YSEALI are definitely, the best and brightest and amazing, remarkable young people. Yeah.
And the fact that they're not, like we take two at a time, and they're never from the same country, which forces all of us to speak English, which is a great idea.
Right. Yes, I think their English improves dramatically from hanging out with me because they had to.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's funny because I do feel like, I don't even know how to describe it, but it feels like men's role is, it's pretty prescribed, but they do seem very invested in their families. It's a huge part of men's sense of themselves as well, that their family is well taken care of. And I do think that they try and support their wives. I just think there aren't a lot of opportunities. So it's, you know what I mean? So the opportunities that they could support their wives in doing are pretty limited, I think. Right. Maybe as part of it. So that does give me some hope for maybe quicker change. The idea that there's definitely a sense of unity and family strength or something, health, I don't know what, there that I think is missing here in a lot of ways, in a lot of homes, in a lot of places, It's still very family-oriented and community-oriented, So.
We have visited many of them in their countries as well, so it's been a great experience.
Good. I'm so glad you were able to do that. Thanks for being here.
We are close to one, but I think we have time for one more question if anyone else has a closing question. Thanks again so much.
Thank
for
you so
coming
much.
today and sharing with us. We really appreciate it.
Yes,
It was
you're
wonderful.
welcome.